December 1946. The Judean desert near the Dead Sea. Two Bedouin shepherds, Mohammed ed-Dib and his cousin, were tending their goats along the rocky cliffs of Qumran. One of their animals had wandered off. The boys began throwing stones into the cliffside caves. You know how it is. Boredom does strange things to young minds. One stone hit something inside a cave. The sound that came back was unlike anything they expected. Not the dull thud of rock hitting rock, but the sharp crack of pottery shattering. The boys froze. They looked at each other. Something was in there. When they climbed into that cave, they found tall clay jars arranged in rows. Inside those jars were scrolls, ancient scrolls wrapped in linen. The shepherds had no idea what they'd found. They took some scrolls to a local antiquities dealer in Bethlehem. Word spread quickly. Soon, archaeologists, historians, and treasure hunters descended on Qumran like locusts. Over the next decade, 11 caves yielded nearly 900 manuscripts. We call them the Dead Sea Scrolls today. Among those scrolls was something extraordinary, something the religious authorities had tried to bury for nearly 2,000 years. The Book of Enoch. Now here's what makes this discovery absolutely stunning. Religious scholars already knew about the Book of Enoch. Fragments and translations had survived in Ethiopia and a few other places. But the Qumran scrolls proved something crucial. They proved this book was ancient. Really ancient. Older than Christianity itself. The texts found in those caves dated back to the 3rd century BCE, and they contained detailed astronomical observations, prophecies, and accounts of heavenly journeys that would make a modern science fiction writer blush. But here's the thing. Despite being quoted in the New Testament itself, despite being revered by early Christians, the Book of Enoch was systematically removed from biblical canon. The question is why? What did this text contain that made religious authorities so uncomfortable? Let me introduce you to the man behind the book, Enoch. Not a household name for most people today, but in ancient times, this figure was absolutely central to religious tradition. According to Genesis, Enoch was the 7th generation from Adam. He lived 365 years. Then, something remarkable happened. He didn't die. The Bible says God took him. Just like that. Enoch walked with God, and then he vanished. No death, no burial, no grave. He was translated directly into the divine realm. Think about how unusual that is. In all of biblical history, only 2 people skip death entirely: Enoch and Elijah. That alone tells you this man was special. But the Book of Enoch takes this story much further. It claims that during his time on earth, Enoch was repeatedly taken up into the heavens. He saw things no other human witnessed. He spoke directly with divine beings. He observed the workings of the cosmos. He learned secrets about the past and future of humanity. And he wrote it all down. Different cultures knew Enoch by different names. The Egyptians called him Thoth. The Greeks knew him as Hermes Trismegistus. In Islamic tradition, he appears as Idris. All of these figures share common characteristics. They're associated with writing, astronomy, and secret knowledge. They serve as intermediaries between the divine and human realms. Some traditions claim Enoch invented the written alphabet itself, that he was the first to study the stars and calculate time. The Emerald Tablet, one of the most mysterious documents in esoteric tradition, is attributed to Hermes, which means it's attributed to Enoch. Consider what that means. This figure appears across multiple civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years. Same character, same attributes, same divine connection. That's not coincidence. Now let's talk about what's actually in this book. The Book of Enoch isn't one text. It's a compilation of 5 major sections. The first section is called the Book of Watchers, and this is where things get really interesting. According to this text, God assigned angels to watch over humanity after creation. These weren't just any angels. They were called the Watchers. Their job was to observe humans and report back to heaven, to make sure humanity stayed on the right path, to prevent knowledge from spreading too quickly. But something went wrong. The Watchers became fascinated with human women. The text describes how 200 of these beings, led by one named Semjaza, made a pact. They knew what they were planning was forbidden. They knew they'd face severe punishment, but they did it anyway. They descended to Mount Hermon. They took human wives, and they began to teach humanity things that were supposed to remain secret. Think about that for a moment. These weren't demons in the traditional sense. They were authorized divine agents, sent specifically to monitor and guide humanity. And they went rogue. They made a choice. They exercised free will. The Book of Enoch is very specific about what these watchers taught humans. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. These weren't random lessons. This was systematic education in sciences that supposedly belonged only to the divine realm. And humanity wasn't supposed to have this knowledge yet. The offspring of these unions were called the Nephilim. Now, the word is often translated as giants. And yes, the text does describe them as enormous in stature. But there's more to it than physical size. The Nephilim were hybrids, part human, part something else. They possessed abilities beyond normal human capacity. They became the mighty men of old, the men of renown that Genesis mentions briefly. The Book of Enoch describes how they devoured all human resources. They began eating people when food ran out. The text portrays them as a plague upon the earth, corrupting everything they touched. And humanity, armed with forbidden knowledge, descended into violence and chaos. This is the setup for the flood narrative, but told from a perspective that mainstream biblical texts don't include. Here's where Enoch himself enters the story as an active participant. The fallen watchers asked Enoch to intercede on their behalf. They wanted him to carry their petition to God, to ask for mercy. Enoch agreed to try. And what happened next is one of the most detailed descriptions of heavenly realms in any ancient text. Enoch describes being transported in what he calls a cloud, but not a normal cloud. This cloud radiated light. It moved with purpose and speed. When Enoch entered it, he found himself inside a structure with walls like crystal, transparent and gleaming. Remember, this is a man from the ancient world. He has no framework for describing advanced technology, no words for materials beyond stone, wood, and metal. Yet he's trying to describe something that sounds remarkably like a craft. The text gets more specific. Enoch says the cloud carried him through layers of heaven, first through a region of cold and ice, then through fire. He describes walls of flame that the cloud passed through without harm. Eventually, he arrived at an enormous structure. The house of God, he calls it, made entirely of crystal. The floor was crystal. The ceiling was moving stars and lightning. Inside was an even larger chamber, a throne room of unimaginable size. The throne itself radiated heat like fire, and on that throne sat the figure he identifies as God, surrounded by thousands upon thousands of beings. Enoch was terrified, but he delivered the Watcher's message. The response was not what they hoped for. God's answer was harsh. You were holy, spiritual beings. You lived eternal lives. Why did you corrupt yourselves with women? Why did you produce giant offspring? Why did you teach humans what they weren't ready to know? You will have no peace. You will watch your children destroy each other, and you will be bound in the depths of the earth until the day of judgment. Enoch returned to earth and delivered this message. The watchers were devastated, but it was too late. The text describes what happened next in terms that sound eerily like ancient accounts of divine warfare. The archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel were dispatched. Michael was sent to bind the watchers. Gabriel was sent to destroy the Nephilim. Raphael was sent to imprison their leader, Azazel, under the desert. Uriel was sent to warn Noah about the coming flood. What follows is a war. Not in the metaphorical sense, a literal cosmic conflict. This wasn't God snapping his fingers and solving the problem. This was prolonged, violent conflict. And when it was over, the fallen watchers were imprisoned in a place the text calls the abyss, deep underground, bound in chains until the final judgment. Their hybrid children were wiped out, and the flood came to reset human civilization entirely. Now let's pause and examine this from a different angle. The Book of Enoch describes technology using the only vocabulary available to an ancient writer. Crystal structures, moving lights, flying vehicles surrounded by fire. Beings that can appear human or radiate pure light at will. Genetic hybridization producing offspring with enhanced capabilities. Systematic teaching of advanced sciences. If you remove the religious language, what are you left with? Here's the thing about cross-species reproduction. In biology, it's generally impossible, unless the species are very closely related. Yet the Book of Enoch describes angels, supposedly spiritual beings, producing viable offspring with humans. Not just one or two flukes, hundreds of them, thousands. For that to be possible, these beings couldn't be fundamentally different from humans. They'd have to be biologically compatible. What does that suggest? Let's look at similar accounts from other ancient cultures. The Sumerian texts speak of the Anunnaki, beings who came from the sky, who created humans by mixing their essence with primitive hominids, who took human wives and produced hybrid offspring, who taught humans agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and metallurgy, who fought wars among themselves that devastated the earth. The parallels to the Watchers are impossible to ignore. The Hindu Vedas describe the Devas, divine beings who descended from the heavens in flying vehicles called Vimanas, who interbred with humans. The Greek myths speak of the Titans and Olympians, powerful beings who took human lovers and produced demigods. The stories are consistent, across cultures, across continents, across thousands of years. Beings from the sky, interaction with humans, hybrid offspring, forbidden knowledge, catastrophic war, great flood, reset of civilization. Think about what we know of human history. According to mainstream archaeology, humans were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. Simple tools, cave dwellings, small tribal groups. Then suddenly, around 4000 BCE, we get Sumer, a fully formed civilization, with written language, complex mathematics, astronomical knowledge, advanced architecture, legal codes, and irrigation systems. No gradual development, just boom, civilization. How does that happen? The Sumerians themselves tell us how. They say the Anunnaki taught them. The gods came down and gave them knowledge. We've dismissed that as mythology, primitive people trying to explain their own advancement. But what if it's not mythology? What if it's history told in the only language they had? Let's talk about something most people never consider: the symbolism of colors in power structures. Throughout history, certain families have claimed descent from the Nephilim bloodline. Royal houses, priestly castes, elite families. They use specific symbols to identify themselves. Blue and red. Why those colors? In ancient symbolism, blue represents the divine, the celestial, the sky. Red represents humanity, blood, earth. Mix them and you get purple, the color of royalty. Look at flags of major powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia. Blue and red. Look at superhero costumes: Superman, Spider-Man, Captain America, all blue and red. These colors imprint on the subconscious. They create associations with protection, authority, power. Now I want you to consider something. What does the God described in the Book of Enoch actually sound like? This being has a physical throne in a physical location. It requires angels to report on human activities because it doesn't automatically know what's happening on earth. It gets angry when its rules are broken. It wages war against rebels over the course of years. It views humans as lesser beings who should remain ignorant and obedient. It's offended that angels would mix with human women, calling it defilement. Does this sound like an omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent creator of all existence? Or does this sound like something else? A powerful being, certainly, advanced beyond human comprehension at the time, but ultimate, infinite, all-knowing. The text itself doesn't support that interpretation. Let me be clear about something before we go further. I'm not here to attack anyone's faith. I consider myself a spiritual person. I believe in a transcendent creative force beyond human understanding. What I'm questioning isn't the existence of that ultimate reality. I'm questioning whether the beings described in these ancient texts are that ultimate reality, or whether they're something else entirely. Something powerful, yes. Something capable of incredible things, but not the source of all existence. That distinction matters. Because if we've been worshiping intermediaries instead of the ultimate, we've missed the point entirely. The Book of Enoch continues with detailed astronomical sections. Enoch describes being shown the movements of celestial bodies, the paths of stars, the cycles of the moon, the changing of seasons. According to the text, the angel Uriel personally taught him these things during his time in the heavens. The level of detail is remarkable. Enoch describes things about lunar cycles that wouldn't be common knowledge for thousands of years. He mentions cosmic phenomena that sound eerily like black holes, regions of space where nothing escapes. The text also includes calendrical information. Enoch describes a 364-day solar calendar that differs from the 354-day lunar calendar most ancient cultures used. It's mathematically elegant, and it predates similar calendar systems by centuries. The later sections of Enoch include prophecies. The text talks about the coming of a figure called the Son of Man, a chosen one who will sit in judgment, who will separate the righteous from the wicked, who will establish a kingdom of peace and justice. Early Christians saw this as a prophecy of Jesus. The language in Enoch matches language in the Gospels remarkably closely. Jesus himself uses the title Son of Man repeatedly. The parallels aren't subtle, they're explicit, which raises an interesting question. If early Christians and Jesus himself drew from the Book of Enoch, why was it later excluded from Scripture? Here's where we need to talk about what happened to this text. For centuries, the Book of Enoch was widely read and respected. It's quoted in the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament. Early church fathers like Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Origen referenced it frequently. But something changed. As Christianity became institutionalized, as it merged with Roman imperial power, certain texts became problematic. The Book of Enoch was one of them. Why? Because it raised too many uncomfortable questions. It suggested that divine beings could rebel, that they had free will, that they could mate with humans, that knowledge itself had been forbidden, that God's control wasn't absolute. These ideas didn't fit the narrative the institutional church wanted to promote. In 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea began the process of standardizing Christian doctrine. Over the next few centuries, various councils debated which texts belonged in the biblical canon. The Book of Enoch didn't make the cut. It was declared apocryphal. Copies were destroyed. Possessing it became dangerous. The text nearly vanished entirely from Western Christianity. Only in Ethiopia did it survive as canonical scripture. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic suppression. The institutional church didn't want people reading Enoch's account, didn't want them asking questions it raised. Better to bury it, to call it pseudepigrapha, to erase it from historical memory. But truth has a way of surviving, even when buried, even when banned. Those Bedouin shepherds in 1946 proved that. They found texts that had been hidden for 2,000 years, texts that confirmed what scholars suspected. The Book of Enoch was ancient. It was authentic. It predated Christianity. It influenced early Christian thought profoundly. The Dead Sea Scrolls changed everything. They forced scholars to reconsider what they thought they knew. They proved that alternative narratives had existed, that the winners of theological debates hadn't just triumphed through truth. They'd triumphed through power, through suppression, through control of information. If the Book of Enoch is accurate, even partially, what does that mean? It means human history is far more complex than we've been taught. It means advanced beings interacted with early humans. It means they provided technology and knowledge. It means they created hybrid offspring. It means they fought wars among themselves. It means civilization didn't develop purely through human ingenuity. The ancient astronaut theory isn't some fringe idea. It's a reasonable explanation for consistent patterns across all ancient cultures. Why did civilization emerge so suddenly? How did ancient people build structures we can barely replicate with modern technology? Why do all ancient cultures describe sky beings teaching them? The Book of Enoch also touches on something deeply personal: individual spiritual freedom. Throughout the text, there's tension between obedience and knowledge. The Watchers were punished for teaching humans forbidden things. But were those things actually evil? Or were they just inconvenient for those in power? Metalworking, astronomy, medicine, writing. These are the foundations of civilization. Yet according to the text, teaching them was a crime. Why? Because knowledge is power. Because educated people ask questions. Because they're harder to control. The same pattern repeats throughout history. Those in power restrict information. They burn libraries. They ban books. Always for your own good, they claim, but really to protect their own authority. Some of you might be thinking this is blasphemy, that questioning sacred texts is wrong. But consider this. If your faith can't withstand questions, is it really faith? Or is it just conditioning? Real spiritual truth doesn't fear investigation. It welcomes it. What fears questions is dogma, control systems, power structures that depend on unthinking compliance. The beings in the Book of Enoch didn't want humans to have knowledge. They wanted obedience, submission, ignorance. Does that sound like ultimate divine love? Or does it sound like control? I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm suggesting you have the right to ask questions, to examine evidence, to think for yourself. Think about Enoch himself for a moment. According to the text, he walked with God. He was righteous. He was chosen for unique experiences. But he was also curious. He asked questions. He wanted to understand. He wrote everything down so others could know. He tried to intercede for the fallen watchers, even though they'd broken cosmic law. He showed compassion. He showed courage. He showed intellectual honesty. These are the qualities the text celebrates, not blind obedience, not unquestioning faith, not passive acceptance. The Book of Enoch describes the end times in vivid detail. A final judgment, a cosmic reckoning. The imprisoned watchers will be released briefly. There will be a war. The righteous will be vindicated. The wicked will be punished. But before that peace, there will be tribulation. The text describes signs. Seasons will shift from their proper times. Human knowledge will advance to godlike levels. People will forget their creators. Violence will increase. The earth will groan under exploitation. Sound familiar? We live in an age where seasons are measurably shifting, where human technology approaches what ancient people would call divine power, where traditional religious belief is declining, where we're consuming Earth's resources at unsustainable rates. Here's something the Book of Enoch understood. Knowledge alone isn't enough. The Watchers gave humans knowledge, lots of it. And what happened? Chaos, destruction, corruption. Why? Because knowledge without moral foundation leads to exploitation. Power without purpose leads to tyranny. This is the central warning of the text. The Watchers taught warfare before they taught peace. They taught how to manipulate nature before teaching respect for it. They taught power before responsibility. And the results were predictable. The same pattern we see today. We split the atom and built bombs. We decoded genetics and created bioweapons. The institutional suppression of this text tells you something important. Those in power fear information they can't control. They fear questions they can't answer. They fear people thinking for themselves. That's why books get banned. That's why knowledge gets restricted. Not because the information is false, but because it's threatening. The Book of Enoch threatened the neat narrative of absolute divine control. It suggested messiness, conflict, beings with agency making choices. That complexity was unacceptable to those building institutional power. They needed clarity, hierarchy, unquestionable authority. So they buried what didn't fit. But something's changing. We live in an information age. Knowledge that was suppressed for centuries is now available to anyone with internet access. The Dead Sea Scrolls are digitized. The Book of Enoch can be downloaded in minutes. The gatekeepers are losing their monopoly. That's both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because we can finally access information that was hidden. Terrifying because we're responsible for what we do with it. The question is whether we have the courage to engage with it honestly, to follow evidence wherever it leads, to question our assumptions. The story of Enoch is ultimately a story about transcendence, about a human who was taken beyond normal human limits, who saw things others couldn't see, who learned things others didn't know, and who came back changed. That's the archetypal journey. Enoch walked with God and was taken up. He crossed the boundary between human and divine, not through death, through elevation, through expansion of consciousness. He became something more than he was, but he remained connected to humanity. He used what he learned to warn others, to prepare them. What does it mean to walk with God? The Book of Enoch suggests it means more than moral behavior, more than ritual observance. It means direct engagement with ultimate reality, unmediated experience of the transcendent. That's not something institutions can control. That's not something that fits in neat theological boxes. It's wild, unpredictable, dangerous, and absolutely essential. Because without that direct connection to something greater than ourselves, we're just following rules we don't understand. The beings Enoch encountered weren't simple. They weren't purely good or purely evil. They had motivations, conflicts, alliances. They made choices. They faced consequences. In other words, they were persons, not mechanical angels programmed to obey. This is crucial, because if these beings had agency, then the universe is fundamentally about relationship, not control, not dominance, but dynamic interaction between free agents. That's messy. It means outcomes aren't guaranteed, but it also means things matter. Choices have weight. Actions have consequences. Consider this. Every great advancement in human history involved crossing boundaries, leaving the trees for the ground, leaving the ground for the sky, leaving Earth for space. Each time, there were those who said we were going too far, violating natural law, playing God, and each time we did it anyway. Because that's what humans do. We push boundaries, we explore, we expand. The Watchers offered humanity a shortcut, knowledge that would normally take millennia to discover. The price was high, but was it wrong? Or was it inevitable? The Book of Enoch includes a fascinating section on Noah's birth. According to the text, when Noah was born, his appearance terrified his father Lamech. The baby's skin was white and red, glowing. His eyes shone with unusual light. He could speak from birth. Lamech was convinced the child wasn't his. Enoch confirmed that Noah was Lamech's biological son. But he also confirmed that Noah was special, chosen for a specific purpose, to survive the coming flood, to preserve humanity. Noah's strange appearance suggested he carried something beyond normal human genetics. This raises an uncomfortable question. If Noah was specially chosen, what about his descendants? The text says all of humanity today descends from Noah, which means all of us carry whatever made Noah special. We're all marked. We all have that trace of the other in our genetics. The Book of Enoch ends with prophecy and promise. The world as we know it will end. Not necessarily the planet, but the current order. There will be judgment, accountability for actions. Then will come what the text calls new heavens and new earth, a reality where the righteous dwell with the divine, where there's no more death or suffering, where knowledge and wisdom are freely available. It's a hopeful vision, but it comes at a cost. Transformation requires destruction of what was. We may be living through that process now. The old systems are failing. The old certainties are crumbling. We're in between. No longer what we were, not yet what we'll become. I want to thank you for staying with me through this journey. I know I've challenged ideas many hold sacred. That's not my intention to cause offense. My intention is to encourage thought, to present information that's been suppressed or ignored. If this has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to read the Book of Enoch yourself. Don't take my word for it. Read the source material. Form your own conclusions. Trust your own discernment. That's what Enoch would want. The story of Enoch reminds us that there's more to reality than what we've been told. That ancient people weren't primitive fools. That their accounts might contain genuine historical memory.
that the beings they described might have been real, that the universe is stranger and more wondrous than our limited perspective allows. We're not done discovering. We're not done learning. The journey Enoch began thousands of years ago continues. We're part of it whether we realize it or not. The question is whether we'll embrace that consciously, whether we'll walk with open eyes, whether we'll have the courage to see what's actually there instead of what we've been conditioned to see. Until next time, stay curious,
Stay questioning. And remember, the truth doesn't fear investigation.